Managed Mentoring Guide for Getting Started in Beekeeping Using a Hive Tool. I am Kevin England. In this lesson teaching you how to use a hive tool, we'll talk about where to make entry in relation to the honeybee nest, how to actually gain entry in by coming through to the specific frames, making a gap to pull the frames into for working the hive, how to restore everything back to order, and we'll talk a little bit about working from one side or the other, whatever is your personal preference. This might seem rather philosophical, but it is underestimated how important the skill is to using a hive tool for the fact that most of the interactions you do with your honeybee hives come through the use of your hive tool. So learning how to use it properly is a super important skill. One of the first things to consider is when you're going into the hive, you want to make sure that you don't do any damage to your queen, given she's the most important bee in the colony. If you look at the illustration, you'll see that the brood nest in a perfect world is centered through the middle, and it would stand to reason that you're going to make access out in the periphery and the resources where the queen will not be. When you pull that frame, you have less risk of damaging and killing your queen. We're going to teach you about a process of creating a gap for which you can pull the other frames into during inspection, and that means that one of the frames is going to be up and out of the hive. In this lesson, we'll show you how to use a frame hanger, and in the future, we'll talk about other methods. A lot of people just take the frame out and lean it against the hive stand or out somewhere where they don't kick it over. We don't actually like that method. We'd prefer you to use a frame hanger if you could, and somewhere along the line, we'll explain to you the use of a quiet box. What's going to follow is how to use the tool properly. We're going to give you a step-by-step guide of how to make your way through using a hive tool to pull the frames. Before we get into that, there's a couple things we have to get out of the way. The first one is preference. Depending on how you have your hive set up, let's say you have it on a rail where you're going to work one hive from the left and another hive from the right, because that's the access that you have. You'll have to adjust your preferences as to how you get in and through the hive accordingly. Most people, as a general rule, are right-handed and right eye dominant. And if you think about those folks, obviously if you're left-handed it's the opposite, you would tend to want things from center to your right to work. So it's pretty typical in instruction that someone would stand to the left behind the hive and work with it off from center to their right side. This lesson kind of shows you both, but we'll assume through most of the illustration that you're standing back and to the left for just a general rule of thumb. If you're following our guidance, you will likely have an internal feeder inside your hive box. It'll be in position 1 like the illustration shows, or maybe it's over in position 10. Eventually, as you grow your colony and get to 2 boxes, you're going to forestall using internal feeders, and you'll have 10 frames in the box. You also will want to build out all 10 frames with honeycomb. We're going to jump ahead in this lesson and assume that you're at that stage, because typically when you're doing inspections, you don't have an internal feeder on board. So you'll note that the images through this presentation do not have the depiction of an internal feeder. In order to get to the frames to use your hive tool to inspect, the first thing you have to do is gain entry to the hive. You'll light your smoker, smoke the front entrance, pop the top cover off, smoke the hole, and use your hive tool to take the inner cover off. That being the case, sometimes the bees will propolize the outer cover to the inner cover where it makes contact. Oftentimes, the seal is not very severe. You could use the palm of your hand to just give a little tap to the bottom of the inner cover or the outer cover edge, and it'll come right off. Other times you may have to use your hive tool up underneath the outer cover, sitting against the edge of the inner cover to pry it off. One tip is, if they did glue it together, when you have the outer cover turned over, scrape off any propolis, and then use your smoker, clear off the inner cover, and go around the edges where it made contact, scraping away any propolis, so the problem will not be as severe next time you go in. Now you're going to take your Hive tool and insert the flat blade between the inner cover and the top edge of the box. Use a little caution here, try not to do any damage to the woodenware. And when you insert the tool in, you're going to insert it in enough that you can push through and pry up so that it pops it off. Now note that sometimes they really glue it together and you may have to insert it, pry up, move it over, insert it, pry up, move it over, insert it, pry up, until you break enough of the propolis seal that you can work your way to pulling the inner cover off. I want to come back and revisit a recommendation from this program that you use a common Hive tool. That was back in lesson 4. What you see on the slide is a depiction of a common Hive tool, and hopefully this is what you have in your kit. Now we recognize that there are dozens of different designs for different Hive tools, and if you have something different, then you're going to have to look at the instruction and adapt to what it is, or go buy yourself a common Hive tool until you get adept at what you're doing, and you can then switch over to something else. If you are using a J-hook or some other variation, maybe you can go to YouTube and look to see how you're supposed to use one of those properly. There's just too many variations for us to cover anything other than standard use. Before we dive in, we want to reiterate a concept that we've been talking about, which is you're going to pull frame number 2. We're going to separate that from its neighbors, extract it out, and hang it on a hanger. And these instructions assume in this section that you're standing to the back left side and you're working from side 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. You smoked the front entrance, you've taken the roof off, you've taken the inner cover off, and now you're ready to go in and extract a frame. We would recommend that you take your smoker and give a quick puff over the frame end of number 2, which is the frame we're going to extract. One on the front end of the hive and one on the back end. That clears the bees in that area for you to insert your Hive tool and not injure or crush bees as you're doing that. The first step in the extraction process is to tilt your Hive tool up so the flat blade is down and go down through the shoulders between frames 1 and 2. You could do this in the front or the back. In this case, it's the back of the hive. You're going to take your Hive tool and move it across the frame and separate the shoulders on the other side. You'll move to the front of the hive, separate between 1 and 2, and then separate between 3 and 4, knowing that the bees were cleared from there from the little puffs of smoke that you gave. In the case of the Hive tool, in order to separate it all the way down, make sure you run the blade through the full width of the shoulders. One thing to keep in mind is that in a new hive, chances are the bees have not worked too much out in the periphery of the hive, and this might not be a necessary step. In the case of this, you'll look and put your insert in and the frame will just slide over. They haven't glued anything together. But when you get to established hives, this is very likely an activity that you will do each time you want to go and extract a frame. If you place 10 frames inside of a box, you will have space to the right and space to the left if all the frames are pushed together. That's going to afford us the opportunity to pull the frames apart so that we can make some space to pull number 2 out of the box. In this case, we've turned the Hive tool around and we've taken the curved blade end, set it down into the gap, and we're going to give it a quarter turn to pull it around. Where it makes contact with the frames, it will pull frame 1 back into the gap to the woodenware, and you repeat this process on both sides in order to get the space that you need. This pulls 1 away from 2 and creates a little bit of space for us to move frame 2 into the gap so we can get it out without crushing bees. With the space created, you can take your Hive tool, stick the blade in, and usually you can do this in one shot since you free the shoulders up, give it a quarter twist, and pull 2 into the gap. Once you have it into the gap, take your Hive tool, lay it flat on frame number 1, stick the corner edge underneath frame number 2, and using a prying motion, you can pry it up and out of the box. Most of the time, you'll pull it up just a little bit, grab it with your fingers, and since you've slid sliced the shoulders, you'll be able to just pull it straight away. Sometimes you'll need to move your hive tool down to the other end and pull it up, especially if it's an established hive, and then you could use both hands to pull it up and out of the box. You have frame number 2 up and out of the hive. If it's early days, chances are it's just foundation. You're not going to see anything but some bees walking around. In time, however, they'll get over there and build comb on it, and you should inspect to see which bees are on it. You're probably not versed at finding the queen at this point, but given there's so few bees, if you look, you probably can pick her out. And if you see the queen is there, you're going to want to put that frame back in. When you're done taking a look at frame number 2, hang it on your hanger. Make sure you put it a little bit away from the woodenware so the bees that are on that frame do not come off and get to the outside of the hive. At this juncture, before you proceed through the box, you might want to take a look at frame number 1 if there's something interesting. Pull it out, take a look, and put it right back in and slide it back into its original position as we move our way through to frame number 3. Working frame number 3, you can go through and slice the shoulders if you need to, but most times when you have a gap, you can use your hive tool and just pop it off using the quarter twist method. Go to the one side of the hive, give it a twist, give it to the other side, and you'll be able to pull it back into the gap, pull it out, and do your inspection. Most times when you're done pulling that frame back into the gap, you can just pull it out with your fingers. But occasionally, and in time, there'll be enough propolis in the hive that you may end up having to use the flat end to go underneath and pry it up. Pull it back to frame number 1 and use that for the leverage you need to get it up and out of the box. Just like frame number 2, you can look and see what's on it, flip it over, look at both sides. And then when you're done, you're going to put it back into the slot. You're not going to hang it on the hanger. And nestle it against frame number 1 using your hive tool to work your way through to get to frame number 4. Pull number 4 into the gap, extract it out, do your inspection, check to see if the comb is well formed, look to see if the queen is on there. Again, if you find the queen on any of these, make sure you put that frame back into the colony for safekeeping. The other thing is, as you're inspecting your frames, try to hold them over the colony. Now, sometimes you may have to walk away from the hive to get into some sunlight or whatever your case may be, but always best to try and work your frames over so any bees that fall off fall down into the hive. Continue to work your way in. 4 goes back in, slit against 3, and you'll try to extract frame number 5, and you'll go as far as you need to go in order to complete your inspection objectives and see what you need to see. Let's assume you've gotten to frame 5 and you have mission accomplished. You saw what you need to see. Maybe you were looking for brood in all stages, or maybe you spotted the queen and everything's good to go. At this point, if you want to restore your frames, you could put your hive tool between 4 and 5, slide 5 back into position, put your hive tool in between 3 and 4, slide 4 over, and so on. We would recommend you just take your hive tool, the blade curved end down, and as the picture depicts, just shove the frames over until they match up, making the gap for position 2, where you can pull your frame off of the hanger and put 2 back in where it came from. There's a subtle thing to note about the picture that you see, which is frame number 1 was tucked against the woodenware. And there's a gap between frame 1 and 2, and there's also still a gap over there on the right-hand side against 10 in the outer woodenware. It's really important that you push your frames together and make sure that the shoulders are touching. This is what we're going to recommend you do, is nestle the frames together and center them in the box. You're going to take your hive tool and go to frame number 10, frame number 1. It doesn't matter where you start. You'll see the premise. Give a quarter turn and push the frames together. Start in the front, go to the back, go to the front, go to the back, or whichever order you want to do. Key here is you're pressing all the frames together and you're centering the frames in the box so it looks like this. The most important part is all the shoulders are touching, so that they don't build propolis between them and that will lock your box up, and that you have even spaces on both sides. So when they get to the point of building the outside of frame 1 and frame 10, you don't have an excess gap and they build wonky comb for you. Okay, we said left back of the hive, but actually I want to be fair to anybody that's going to work from the other side. And really, as you see by the picture, you're just using the gap on the alternate side. You're going to pull frame number 9 and you're going to work with 8 into the gap, then 7 into the gap, 6 into the gap. This is just working the same thing from the other side. Personal preference, doesn't matter how you do it, there's no right or wrong. Again, most right-handed dominant people would work from frame 1 over, but there's no reason to believe you can't work from the other side, especially in that circumstance where you have them on a rail and you're going to work the one on the left side from the left and you're going to work the one on the far right from the right. Skipped ahead a step here and just went to frame number 6. Somebody's doing an inspection. When you're done, you're going to use your Hive tool, just like we explained before, to push all the frames over, get everything settled in. You can save time by pushing all 3 instead of one by one. And remember, in the early days when it's cool, maybe the weather is a little cloudy and so on, you want to be as efficient as possible in working your hive and close it up as quickly as you can. So you'll slide all the frames over, create the gap, and perform the same activity as we said just a moment ago to center all your frames and get the shoulders together. Last thing to say as we come to a close in this lesson is there are a number of ways to make entry into a hive. This is our favorite one and one we teach almost universally. If you know of a different method or have heard something else, we'd be interested in hearing what you think are the pros and cons of those things, but we really anticipate that this is a superior way to a lot of the other options that are out there. One thing to reiterate is do keep in mind that hive configurations are different. Every one of them is like a child. They all are unique. And maybe the brood is on one side or the other, and you'll adopt your process based on where the bees are building their brood nest. In our next topic, we'll move to feeding colonies. We'll get into record keeping, equipment prep for future stages for summer management, and a couple other topics that are in the schedule. It's time for us to share, as we always do, that if you have questions, you can bring them to our next online session. You can also send an email to the email address on your screen. Or if you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment from the video below. Make sure that you subscribe while you're there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.